You want the number of people who don't like your novel to be as low as possible. So to help you do that, I've compiled a list of 5 things to avoid so you can avoid having people avoid having positive things to say about your novel, which will cause people to avoid your novel, which is generally something you want to avoid. Speaking of things you shouldn't avoid, consider subscribing to my channel. I generally avoid overusing specific words in my intros. I think some people are averse to that. All right, sign number 1 that readers will hate your novel: it's not built front to back. In an ideal world, people would wait until they've read your entire novel before passing judgment. They would give you the benefit of the doubt and withhold evaluation until they know all the facts, until they've read the thing from cover to cover. Well, honey, we don't live in an ideal world. A reader's opinion about a novel starts to form from the reading of the first line and will continue to be formed throughout, with everything they've read before biasing their opinions of everything they encounter further on in the work. If the worst scene in your novel, the least engaging, boringest, whatever, is the first scene in the novel, that's bad because at the early stage, the reader's opinion is shaped entirely by that one scene. The only experience they have with the novel is a bad one. No matter how good the rest of the novel is, that early negative experience is going to sour them to some degree. On the other hand, if the weakest scene in your novel is, say, 65% of the way through it and you've built up goodwill with the reader throughout the story, then that weak scene is not going to have as much of a detrimental effect as the weakest scene being at the beginning of the story, because the reader has developed a positive opinion about the story. Now, you can absolutely ruin a novel at any point with a crappy scene, and ending with a bad scene will likely sour the reader on the rest of the novel, no matter how good it is. But if your opening doesn't engage them, if your opening is lackluster, they will never get to that point, and it won't matter how good the rest of the novel is. Remember, most people will only ever see the title of your novel. Some percentage of those people will read the blurb, a smaller percentage will read the preview on Amazon or whatever, and then an even smaller percentage of those people will actually read the book. And of the people who actually sit down to read the book, some of them may stop partway through if they don't like what they see. Based on this, if you want to have the most goodwill and the best opinion of your novel, the opening should not be the weakest part and may warrant more attention than the rest of the novel. A really good opening with a mediocre ending is probably okay. A really bad or mediocre opening with a really great ending will probably not do as well. Sign number 2 that people won't like your novel: it doesn't have an established rule set, or it violates the established rule set. Fantasy writers spend a lot of time thinking about magic systems and the rules associated with that magic system. What it can and can't do, what's allowed and not allowed within the rules that make up that system. This is to avoid the oft-repeated criticism of the fantasy genre that claims the author can just make anything happen at any point, and therefore there's no tension and no point in reading those kinds of books. I think it would behoove writers of other genres to apply that same sort of thinking to the rule sets present in their respective stories. A lot of genres besides fantasy have magic system-esque rule sets in them. Say you have something like a John Grisham style legal thriller. Something like a court case has a lot of similarities to a fantasy magic system. There's certain moves that are allowed, different techniques have different effects, the players can have different levels of skills and strengths. Based on every episode of Suits I've ever seen, walking dramatically into a room with a file folder and spouting some kind of quippy remark is apparently one of the most powerful moves in the entire law profession. If you violate the rule set present in a legal thriller, if you reference a law that doesn't exist, or someone does something in a courtroom that wouldn't be allowed, then it could easily ruin your story, especially if it centers around a major plot point. If the conflict gets resolved by violating a rule set, then that's a problem. You can also run into situations where the reader has expectations about a rule set, and if your novel operates with a different rule set, then that can turn the reader off. This can happen with romance stories, which tend to follow a lot of unspoken rule sets that most people kind of understand going into those kinds of stories. If you have a character who behaves in a not great way and their partner forgives them or falls in love with them despite some kind of flaw or behavior, the reader might say, that character would never forgive them for that, because in the reader's mind, your novel violates the rule set that they have in their mind around romance. The reader is coming to the novel with specific assumptions about what's acceptable and how people behave, and if your novel violates those rules, then that's a problem. Understanding the rule set of your novel potentially requires defining your own rules in the case of something like a fantasy magic system, or researching a system like you would have to do in a forensic or legal type of story. Or it may involve just understanding what the reader expects and believes about something like the pursuit of romantic relationships. Violating that rule set as a rule is a recipe for disaster. Sign number 3 that readers won't like your novel: it doesn't stand on its own. All of the information needed to fully enjoy your novel should be contained within the novel. That sounds obvious, but it doesn't always happen. One place where this can happen is if you do a lot of outlining, because there's the potential to create information that is important for understanding the novel, but doesn't end up in the novel. You, the writer, know this information, and that affects how you perceive the novel, but someone reading the novel doesn't have access to that information and therefore will have a different feeling about the work. This is not a knock against outlining, it's just one potential pitfall of the process that you need to be aware of, and you can have the same thing happen if you aren't working from an outline, so this is not a problem that's directly caused by outlining. One place that you'll see this manifest is in really bad responses to critiques. Someone will read someone's work and say something like, this part doesn't make sense, and then the writer will pipe up with a bunch of excuses and additional information that wasn't part of the actual work, but makes the thing suddenly make sense. You can't be over the reader's shoulder explaining things to them, or defending the work, or giving additional information. The novel has to do all of that. One sort of example of this, so the Wheel of Time series, someone built an app that's like crib notes for all of the characters in the series. These books have something like 2,500 named characters or something ridiculous, so it's understandable that a lot of people get confused and want something to reference. Now, The Wheel of Time is still an amazing series, and I think it does a pretty good job of managing such a large cast. I read the whole thing without needing this app, but I probably missed some parts of the story because I lost track of or forgot who a specific character was, because there's over 2,000 of them. If the reader needs external information to optimally enjoy a novel, then that's a sign that it isn't entirely standing on its own. If people need additional information, or they need to have someone on the internet explain why a character did something, that's a sign that the novel isn't standing on its own, and that's not a good thing. Next up, sign number 4 that people won't like your novel: it lacks coherency. I'm realizing more and more that a good novel needs to have something that all its parts are aimed towards. Some kind of central element that anchors the story. You can write a good novel that doesn't have this, but I don't think it will move people on an emotional level. This is partially a comfort thing. It gives the reader a feeling of familiarity. This is partially a comfort thing. It gives the reader a feeling of familiarity with the story, something they can get their arms around. Our brains really like to predict patterns, and we get a little shot of happy chemicals every time we predict one. This is why music is so enjoyable, because it's basically predictable patterns. It's why songs get stuck in your head. This could be the theme, it could be the motif, it could just be that your story involves NYPD detectives dealing with the mafia. That's something that most audiences, most Western audiences at least, are kind of familiar with, that they kind of understand. It could also be a plot promise as well. If your novel is a revenge story, or if it's set up to have the naive farmhand be mentored to take on the evil wizard, then that can sort of anchor the story together. I also have a half-baked theory that this idea primarily benefits the author. Because you have something to point your plot and characters at, it creates a better environment for producing good writing because you eliminate alternatives. Instead of thinking, what's the coolest thing that can happen in this scene, you're thinking, what's the coolest thing that serves the coherency of my story that can happen in this scene? By eliminating alternatives, you spend less time trying to figure out what to do and more time making what you do work as good as it can work. If you want a more concrete example of this, The Hatchet by Gary Paulson has some really great coherency around a central element, the hatchet. I guess that would be more of a steel-like example, not concrete. Anyway, The Hatchet centers around a kid who survives a plane crash and then has to survive in the part of Canada where there are still moose but not yet polar bears. And he has to do this by using a hatchet that his mother gave him, which is the only thing that he has. Basically, every major emotional beat, every major plot point in that story is centered around that hatchet. It plays a pivotal role throughout the entire plot. It even serves as the title of the book. So the hatchet is very coherent around the hatchet. Now, this is kind of an extreme example, and I don't think you need to build your story around one singular element quite like this, but I do think you need to have something. You need to have some kind of thread running through it. Otherwise, it's just going to seem like a mishmash of different events, and it's not going to have the same sort of emotional impact. And lastly, sign number 5 that people will hate your novel: you don't trust the reader. The most impactful idea you will ever convey will be caused by your writing, but not stated by your writing. This idea permeates all of the major advice around storytelling. Stories are not about relating conclusions, they're about triggering conclusions. Show Don't Tell, at its heart, really gets to this idea. We don't tell the reader it's cold out. We show it to them by the characters shivering or their visible breath. Writing that shows is ultimately writing that allows the reader to draw their own conclusions. You don't tell them what they should feel. You evoke the emotion and make them feel it. This goes for simple things like describing how it's cold outside, all the way up to the major theme or plot revelations or results of character arcs in your novel. You would never tell the reader that a formerly insecure character has now become confident. You show them being confident. You don't tell the reader how the character has changed. You show that they are changed. You don't beat the reader over the head with your thematic message. You let them gather it based on the events you tell in the story. Whatever message, whatever value your novel is meant to convey needs to be grasped by the reader themselves. You need to lead them to water and get them to drink without forcibly grabbing them and shoving their head underwater. I tried that with a horse once. Neither of us enjoyed it. Speaking of things neither of us enjoyed, this video is over. Wait, that's not a very flattering conclusion. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.